First of all, I want to welcome you to this webinar on using and leveraging Bloom's taxonomy in test development. I'm very happy to be presenting this webinar on behalf of Assessment Systems Corporation, and our CEO, Nate Thompson, is also here as well. So just to give you a little bit of a lay of the land before we get started, there may be a few times in the webinar where I may ask for some feedback from you. So in that case, you can use the chat button at the bottom of the screen to provide the feedback. And then also, if you have any questions, please feel free to use the Q&A button as well to ask for question or to ask questions. And I think we'll have some time at the end of the session to also go over questions. And Nate, if you could just help me in monitoring the Q&A in the chat, that would be great. So before we get started on the webinar, just a little bit about me and why I became interested in using Bloom's taxonomy. I've worked in assessment, primarily in certification exams. I work for 3 healthcare certification exam boards for about 20 years. But before that, I also taught at a couple of universities and colleges. So I've used Bloom's taxonomy both from the assessment perspective as well as from the education perspective. And in assessments, I've been working primarily in test development and item development, and everything from conducting JTAs to writing items and training item writers and that sort of thing. So I have practical use and experience both as an instructor in creating my syllabi and my assessments within my courses, as well as from the high stakes and credentialing perspective. Briefly, my team, I'm Vice President of Client Solutions at ASC. And so my team is responsible for everything related to developing and launching certifications. That includes program management, job task analysis, item writing, and we can also provide full test development support. We also have a psychometric team at ASC led by Dr. Tammy Trielwaller, and she and I worked very cohesively on clients who want full development, test development support, including psychometric services. So with that said, let's get started talking about Bloom's. And what I hope to go over today is to explain sort of the purpose and the structure and the history of Bloom's taxonomy. Some of this might be a review for you if you're familiar with Bloom's. And then I want to describe my experiences and how I think Bloom's and have seen Bloom's cognitive taxonomy be used in developing assessments. And then we're going to have some practice applying Bloom's taxonomy to task statements on test blueprints and to test items. So you can kind of see how it would be used practically, but also some of the things that you need to consider when you want to implement it, and just consider in test design in general. So let's begin with just a brief history of Bloom's taxonomy. And first of all, with talking about what it is, it's a framework for categorizing educational goals or instructional objectives. And it's been around for a long time, 70 years. It was first developed by Benjamin Bloom and his colleagues in 1956. That was the original cognitive taxonomy. That's probably the one that most of us are familiar with, but there are actually two other parts of the taxonomy of instructional objectives that were developed later. And the original Bloom's, as I said, covers the cognitive, the thinking processes part of developing instructional objectives, or in our case, developing assessment items. What do you want the candidate to do? What sort of thinking needs to be applied? But the other two deal with two other aspects that you may be considering in education or in assessment, depending on what type of tests you have. And the first of these was the affective domain. And that focuses on kind of those, what we call, although I don't really like this term, soft skills. And that would be things like attitudes, values, feelings. So for instance, if you teach a healthcare ethics course, you would probably want some affective domain educational objectives. My background is in health data management. That was my original career. And so if I was teaching about patient confidentiality, I would obviously want my students to value confidentiality. And some components of assessment exams may have some of those attitudes, feelings, and values. With things like situational judgment tests, that's becoming more and more common to want to test and assess and evaluate that. And then the third part of the whole comprehensive taxonomy was developed to consider the psychomotor domain. So those are focused on physical skills or actions. So a surgeon or a dentist, and being able to perform the actual function of performing a surgery or doing dental work. And this might be a domain that we in the assessment world think about when we're developing performance tests, where you actually have to do and demonstrate a skill. Now, the original cognitive domain, which is what we're going to be focusing on today, was revised due to some criticisms of it and just a need to update it. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the criticisms of Bloom's as well. Was revised in 2001. One of the people who worked on the revision was actually a student of Benjamin Bloom, but I can't remember which one, but it was revised more recently. So taking a look at the original versus the revised taxonomy, the original taxonomy included 6 levels that ranged from knowledge. You just need the knowledge. Then the next domain was comprehension. You need to be able to understand. Application, you need to be able to apply. Analysis, you need to be able to analyze. Then synthesis and evaluation. And it was arranged in a hierarchy. The revised taxonomy, one of the things it did was that it changed the words to more active words. So they became verb words. So knowledge went to remember. And then understand, apply, analyze, evaluate, and create. So you can see that they changed the top 2 portions of the taxonomy as well. There was a lot of debate, and even in my own mind, I think about, is synthesis, does that really occur before evaluation? Maybe sometimes, depending on the body of knowledge you're studying or the task at hand, it does, but sometimes you might have to evaluate before you can synthesize. So that was changed to evaluate and create being the highest part of the taxonomy. In the revision, there was also a two-dimensional framework. So it considered the cognitive processes that we just discussed, but it also just considered in sort of this grid-like way of the knowledge that was being involved. So in other words, were you remembering factual knowledge? Conceptual, is it concepts or principles? Is it more procedural knowledge? Or it also considered metacognitive knowledge, which is basically your own self-awareness and sort of the strategic knowledge you have and being able to apply what you've learned. So let's talk with that background in mind. Let's talk a little bit about what Bloom's is and what it isn't. So first of all, just kind of generally, what is a taxonomy? And just in general, a taxonomy is a system for applying and organizing things into categories that have shared characteristics. So it provides this structured hierarchy that we showed in the triangle of the different verbs or words of the Bloom's taxonomy. And there are taxonomies everywhere in professions and in life. So if you think about in high school or in your education, somewhere you probably had to study the biological taxonomy of kingdoms, phylums, subphylums. It's been so long I can't remember the order, but that's a taxonomy. The Dewey Decimal System that was developed to classify and organize books is a taxonomy. I mentioned my background is in healthcare, and every time that you go to the doctor, your doctor's visits and your diagnoses are classified by something called the International Classification of Diseases. It's also a taxonomy because it's organized in a hierarchical way of first the body system that's involved and then the different types of diseases until it gets more granular into those diseases. Just as an interesting little tidbit, when I used to teach, I taught a course called nosology, which is the classification of medical diseases and symptoms. So now you have a new word for today as well, nosology. So Bloom's taxonomy itself is a taxonomy of cognitive demand. And what I mean by cognitive demand is the level and type of mental effort that's required to engage with and complete a task, activity, or problem. So when a test candidate is interacting with an assessment question, are they being asked to recall knowledge, or are they being asked to be able to analyze a situation that's within the test question or the prompt? Are they being asked to create something from a brand new? So that would be a way of classifying the cognitive demand or the level and type of mental effort that's required to answer that test question or test item. And as we saw, there's this hierarchy, and there are verbs. If you look online, and you've probably seen these, I just put a few words here that can give you some clue about what level it might be within the Bloom's taxonomy. So one of the ways you can think about this is on your test blueprint. What verbs are you using if you have your blueprint created by task that they may do if it's a certification job, blueprint, and it's tasks that they're doing on the job. What verbs are you using within those tasks gives you an idea of the cognitive demand required by that test question. So let's take a look at applying some applying Bloom to some test items. And I used math just because it's something we all had to learn at some time, not that I'm a math expert. So the first question here is, which of these is a prime number? These are all multiple choice. So if you want to put in your chat whether you think that first test question about prime numbers is recall, is it, remember, understand, analyze, evaluate, create. Most of us probably would think that is a remember or a recall question, and I would agree with that. There's a little bit of knowledge that you have to apply, but this is probably mainly recall. Now, if you look at the second question about a rectangle with the length of 12 centimeters and a width of 5 centimeters, what's its area? That would probably be an analysis question, but I say probably because it depends upon sort of how you interpret it. Is it application or is it evaluation of the problem? And then the last question of two numbers have a sum of 30. One is 6 more than the other. Which equation represents this situation if x is a smaller number? That is more like an evaluation question, probably. But again, that's one of the, when I say probably, that's one of the sort of criticisms, if you will. It's not as clear cut as you would think it would be. When I worked at a certification organization, we used Bloom to classify all of our test items, and we would have debates amongst CSMEs as to whether it was an application question or it was an analysis question. So it's not as straightforward as the and as simple as the taxonomy would have you believe. And we'll take a look at some of the other issues as to why that is. So if we look at this little cartoon, and it's a class, and it says you have $100 and spend $67 at the grocery store. How much money do you have left? Well, we have three situations here with the three students. One of them sees that exact question in a textbook. So all they have to do is, even if their textbook wasn't open, if they remembered that question, they wouldn't have to work it out. They would go by memory. The second one is actually using a calculator. And the third student is trying to work it out in his head. So although when this question was being asked or written, if it's a written assessment, we may have intended it to be an application question. It depends upon the circumstances of the person who's being asked about it and how they gathered that information. So Bloom's is not simply, I like to think of it as not simply being a property of the test item. It's also a property of the person taking the test and their background and their experience. So, you think about this, and that's one of the reasons why harvesting items and having access to items is so important, and test security is so important, because the playing field may not always be even, and it might not be that they're actually understanding or comprehending or evaluating, they're just recalling, which is the lower level of the Bloom's taxonomy. So I'm going to modify my definition of what Bloom's is a little bit and say that it's a taxonomy of cognitive demand, the level and type of mental effort typically required to engage with and complete a task, activity, or problem. So it really depends upon the person's situation. If they've been well prepped for an exam and they've actually seen that situation before in part of their learning or their preparations for the exam, even though the intent of the test writer might have been that it's going to be an application or analysis level, it may simply be recall because they're recalling. Now, you could also argue that at some point in the past, perhaps they did have to do that analysis and now they're simply recalling. But again, it depends on the situation of the candidate and their background. Do they actually just recall it for memorizing it, or were they actually required to analyze or evaluate or whatever the intended mental effort was at some point in time? Um, Another issue with Bloom's is the issue of difficulty versus cognitive demand. So these are two questions, and I apologize that these are very US centric questions because, and I know that there are people from outside of the US, but it was the example that I could think of. So if you think about the cognitive demand of these two items, the intent was, and it was memorization. The first one, when was the Declaration of Independence adopted by the Continental Congress? That's something we learn. If you're an American going to school, you learn when the Declaration of Independence was signed. However, we may not know, and to be honest with you, I had to look this up. I could not make this question up on my own because I didn't even remember the Battle of Saratoga if I was taught that in school in the past. So that's a more obscure kind of piece of knowledge. So even though the two of these are both recall questions or remember questions, which one, based upon what I just said, do you expect would be more difficult, would have lower p-values if we want to talk about difficulty in a statistical sense? Probably the one in the green box because it's more obscure information. So people often just in, sort of casual commentary think about Bloom's as being synonymous with difficulty of an item. And it's related to that, but it's not a clear or direct correlation with difficulty because you can have recall questions, for example, that are very difficult simply because they're such obscure information or trivial information. I know you want to avoid that when you're testing, but sometimes it happens. So Bloom's is not totally synonymous with how difficult the question is. So, and that's what I just said. It's not totally synonymous with difficulty level. So with that kind of in mind, and I've already talked about some of the criticisms of balloons, but let's look at what the experts say about it. So benefits versus criticisms. Why Bloom's is helpful. Well, it does provide a clear, easy to understand framework. It encourages higher order thinking. By higher order, I mean those top levels of the Bloom's taxonomy, the create, evaluate kind of levels. It's helpful when you're, I think, from an assessment perspective, just kind of evaluate, even if you do it informally, are your questions simply recall questions, or are they asking for something that would require more higher level thinking? From the education side, it supports scaffolding, which means having a foundation and building upon that foundation of knowledge. And then it's also adaptable. It can be used in almost any type of coursework, learning Latin to, you know, management accounting, because you're all using different levels of learning and different levels of instructional objectives as you go along. Why it's criticized? Bloom's has been around, as I said, for 70 years. And in spite of that 70-year history, there's really a lack of empirical validation in studies that validate that, yes, this is the hierarchy of how people learn and of the mental effort and cognitive demand. As I mentioned earlier, it's also sometimes an oversimplification. It's not as easy to classify those items into the levels as is being being thought of by that hierarchy. And it also doesn't account for learning differences. Some of us think very linearly. We go from A to B to C. Others of us might be able to jump from A to C. So it doesn't account for those kinds of differences. And because of all those sort of drawbacks of using Bloom's, it's also at risk of being used in a very mechanical way, of being oversimplified, as I said. It's not as easy to classify as you think it should be or would be by the taxonomy itself. So summing up some of the benefits versus criticisms, Bloom's, it's been around so long, and if you work in education or assessment, you've probably at least heard of it. It has endured because it offers clarity and shared structure for instruction and assessment. So there is a structure to begin talking or thinking about it, about cognitive demand as you're developing educational instructional objectives or developing test items. But it shouldn't be used as a universal model of how learning happens. So use it flexibly as a guide rather than a rule book. It can guide you, but it's not always as I said, straightforward as we would want to think about it. So let's talk more specifically about how Bloom's is used for assessment development. And before I do that, if you want to just type in the chat or the Q&A, do you use Bloom's in any way in your programs or work experience or situations that you're involved with on the job? Um, someone said yes. A couple of people said yes, but not all the time. Others said not so far. So there are some people who are using it, and a little bit later we'll talk about and get your ideas of how it's being used. So most of the time when I've seen it used, I've seen more of what I call a collapse bloom being used. It's very difficult sometimes to, first of all, evaluate whether this is actually analyze or apply or where it belongs. And the more, when you write, particularly when you're in assessment and you write test items, the more complexity you add, the more difficulty it can create for the item writers as well as for trying to assemble an exam. So usually it's collapsed into something that is the categories are a bit broader and there are less of them. I've typically seen them with knowledge, application, and evaluation, or the words might be different. It may be recall rather than knowledge. So I've typically seen it collapse into sort of a 3-level model where since there are 6 components of the actual taxonomy, they're sort of crosswalked into those 3 levels. And then so why that's done is I kind of already mentioned, just practically, it's easier for blueprints, it's easier for item writers. Also, there's a little bit of, by doing that, there may be a little bit of some of the reduction in some of the ambiguity and sort of inconsistencies of classification because it's not as granular. So let's talk about an example of how it could be used. And this is an example from the test blueprint perspective. So this is, I used to, because I was involved in health data management, I used to work at AHIMA and I was also certified by them for a while. So this is an example from their publicly available test blueprints. Now, to give you some background, they have 2 levels of certification for health information. One level is a managerial level, and the other level is a more technician level. And these are statements from their test blueprints for the managerial and the technician level in the area or the domain from the blueprint on access, use, and disclosure of health information. So one column is task 1 through 7 is from the manager level, and one column, task 1 through 7, is from the technician level. And again, the managers manage, the technicians can supervise, but they, just to kind of generalize it, they're more involved in the work itself. So looking at the verbs that are used in those tasks, which column, the left or the right, would you think would be the manager level? And you can put that in the chat as well, either left or right for the manager level. And you can also, if you would also put the verbs, which are the first word in those task statements that led you to believe your choice. Right, for manager, yes, because if you look at the terms, ensure, which is kind of a wishy-washy word anyway, but ensure, develop, advocate, all of those sort of imply some of those higher level activities. So when you're writing test items to address these areas, you want to make sure that you might have some test items that are kind of lower level, but you also want to make sure that you're writing to the level of the task statement as well, so that you do have some questions that actually are written to sort of that level of cognitive demand. Now, when I think of using Bloom's, I think of it being used in two ways. One is, and someone put in the chat that it's more of a policy than it is actually useful. I think of it being used in two ways. And the first one, the advisory way, may be that it's more of a policy. It's a guidance for item writers, particularly for new item writers. Who may be new to writing test items, it's much easier to write at the recall level, right? You can just remember level, look something up in the book and change, the statement from the book to a question. What year did Hawaii become a state or whatever? It's very easy to write those kinds of questions. It's much harder, particularly if you're writing multiple choice questions, to write them at the higher order thinking level. So I think it's helpful to train item writers on Bloom's simply so that they can start thinking about how they write test items at the higher order level. It's also helpful to sort of do that comparison between your test blueprint and the items you have in your item bank for particular domains. And are they actually written in sort of when you evaluate all the test items, do you have items that are written to match those task levels and the intention? Of what is the cognitive demand that is required of those tasks? Or are your item writers tending to write all at the lower levels, but you have tasks on the blueprints at the higher levels as well? Another way to use it is what I call more compulsory. And that is that it's actually incorporated into the test blueprint. And I will show you that. So this would be an example of a blueprint matrix that actually incorporates Bloom's taxonomy into it. Now, a long time ago, when I first got involved in assessment, the blueprint at the organization I was working at used this kind of blueprint. So they had domains and there were tasks under the domains as well. But then they also had for the blueprint what percentage of items for each of those areas were going to be written at recall, application, and I think ours were recall, application, and analysis. But we had the three levels. And there was some sort of formula that looked at and analyzed the verbs of the test blueprint to determine how the distribution was going to be amongst knowledge, application, and evaluation for each of those domain areas. Now, what this did is it made it much more difficult, if you think about it, to build a test blueprint, right? Because if you think about it, you have to have an adequate number of items in each one of those cells. And the more cells you get in the test blueprint, the more complicated it becomes to build that blueprint and to build a test. So that's one of the considerations of using it in more of a compulsory way. More recently, I've seen it used just as an advisory. For instance, at ASC, I have some clients who we manage their item blank and we do item writer training for their subject matter experts. And we tell them about Bloom's simply to get them thinking about writing higher order questions, but it's not mandated by the test blueprint. That's how I've seen it used more recently. And I think some of that is because of some of the criticisms with Bloom, but also just the complexity of trying to build a blueprint in that way, that the more complex it gets, the harder it is. So here's some discussion questions, and I would also be interested in your ideas about this. And I think I've already answered the first one. So if you were asked this on a test, it would probably be a recall question because I've answered it. What are the advantages and disadvantages of using a content versus Bloom's matrix exam blueprint like we just saw? Well, it's the complexity of having to build it, and is a disadvantage. Also, it's sort of a mechanical use of Bloom's. As a disadvantage. An advantage may mean maybe just trying to make sure that you do have items spread across the cognitive demand level so that you're not all of the exams are on your test are not at the recall level. In large scales assessments, what challenges might arise in trying to measure the upper levels of Bloom's taxonomy? Anyone, you can, in addition to just putting in the chat, you can also just put your mic on and answer as well. Anybody have any ideas of some of the challenges?
I'm not sure that the mic
Works
in the webinar format. I think
okay.
it's
Okay.
one way.
Then if you want to just write it in the chat, that would be it's difficult to do. Yes, it's very difficult to write at even for experienced IDA writers to write at the upper levels of Bloom's. Particularly, I think, and this may be my own opinion, but I've written enough items, particularly if you're writing multiple choice questions, it's very hard to get, it's possible, but it's harder, much harder to get those upper levels of Bloom's. So when you're working with a high stakes assessment, you're trying to write a lot of test items. It can be very hard to write the number of items you need quickly if you need to do that when you're trying to work at the upper levels. It's much easier to spend 5 minutes writing 5 recall questions quickly than trying to write one at a higher level. And then the third question is, how might Bloom's taxonomy guide the determination development of multiple choice items versus task-based items? I think one of the things it can be good for is actually beginning to help you think about, and this goes back maybe to the more psychomotor domain as well, to really think about, is this something that we can test to the fullest measure possible in a multiple choice or even in sort of a written testing situation, or would it be better tested on a performance test so that we can test it more fully? And began to think about, okay, if it's not possible to do a performance test, how can we break down that task to determine the knowledge that is applied to be able to look at it successfully, to be able to test it in a sort of more written multiple choice situation. So to give you an example of both of those contexts, I was working with a organization that was trying to develop a test for midwives and their use of ultrasounds. And when we did the test blueprint, we knew that we were going to have both a written assessment and a performance-based test. And so being able to think about from the task at hand, if this needed to be assessed in a written situation, or was it something that needed to be assessed in a performance test. And then also thinking about, I worked, sorry, I lost my train of thought of the other example I was going to use, but I also worked at, I mentioned working with teaching people how to code. Diagnoses and assign the codes for the classification system. In order to do that, now it's much different, but this was in the sort of ancient years, they had to actually look things up in books, and there were rules that you had to apply to determine like where you went in the books in the index to look up the code and how you applied the rules, etc. Well, in a testing environment, sometimes it made it very difficult to test the actual book situation, because there were different kinds of books and there were these 3 huge books. So we had to break down the task into, okay, where would you look to find this code? And so we were breaking down that performance task into separate areas to be tested. And Bloom's would help to know like what level of knowledge you need to be able to break down that performance task into understanding what they were actually doing when they were performing. And then the last question is, do you think all credentialing, so certification assessments, should include higher order thinking? Why or why not? I agree. Somebody said at university level, it needs to have higher order thinking, and that's my same sort of rationale. I think it's very difficult to think of any job where you would have to only apply lower level thinking skills. We wouldn't want to go to a doctor who only applies lower level thinking skills. We wouldn't want to go to an accountant who only applies lower level thinking skills. So I think higher order thinking when we're thinking about, and that's, um, professions and certification and things that you study at university, definitely higher order thinking needs to be involved. There was a very good comment that it's become easier to write items at higher level with multimedia and innovative item development. And I would totally agree with that. That's a very good point. If you think about, even if you have a multiple choice exam, if you can put a graph or chart or diagram on in a test question, you're asking them at least in some way to apply knowledge. As long as they haven't, you're not using a graph or a diagram that they've seen before. So I would agree it's easier when you have multimedia. And I would also agree that um, um, the items take longer to answer when it's higher order thinking, because there's more complexity that tends to be involved. Sometimes the other thing I think that technology has provided are ways of testing that aren't strictly multiple choice, but may not be constructed response questions, because constructed response questions present, their own challenges in scoring, and that kind of thing. But you can have things like hotspots, again, taking advantage of some multimedia. And there are other ways that you can do more selected response type items that may be better equipped to test some of the higher order thinking skills as well. So with that, we have about 10 minutes left. Any final questions or comments? Yeah, someone provided a horror story. I think that's one of the issues of when Bloom's is strictly applied. It's again using it in a mechanical way. And someone else provided an example of SPS for students to download a data file. Yes, there's all kinds of, particularly I think in the educational setting, where you can be more creative in developing test questions that write higher order thinking. In a standardized test, it may be a little bit more difficult, but still, I think it's something that we need to think about, is matching the level of cognitive demand typically required on the job with what we're testing in a certification or licensure or professional qualifications test. It says, similar to scaffolding and instructions, what do you think of testing over building blocks? So testing something you need to know before analyzing. And that's definitely something, particularly in an educational setting, you probably want to do. If you think about how you organize your syllabus, you're probably starting with lower level concepts and then moving up. So with that, thanks for your comments and your attentiveness and your attendance, and have a good rest of your day. Thank you.